My name is Jason Hooper from FixYourGut.com, and this is part 2 of my series on how to do a dopamine detox. Now, if you haven't watched part 1, it's fine. You can watch these in any order. There's no particular order to anything. Part 3 will be about lifestyle choices that affect your dopamine circuits. And part 4, unfortunately, will be restricted to membership-only content on the FixYourGut.com site because it's not very advertiser friendly, if you get what I mean, or suitable for people of all ages. So we've strategically placed that sort of content on the membership site, which is a pretty reasonable membership to sign up for. So if you're interested in that, go ahead and sign up. Otherwise, part 1 is over how your taste buds affect your dopamine. This is part 2, which will be about the pharmacokinetics, certain compounds that we ingest that have effect on dopamine. And part 3, certain behaviors that we have. And then, of course, part 4, membership. So I just want to do a little bit of recap on the importance of doing a dopamine detox. Why should we do it? And sort of understand the mechanisms and the inner workings at play in the nervous system and the brain that influence us. Now, there's always been this argument of nature versus nurture. You know, what's really driving us? Is it something that we're doing and conscious of, or is it something environmental? You know, what's playing the biggest role? And if you look at it in the short term, all of the data show that in the short term, as we react to our environment, we have basically very little control. And that's kind of a scary thought, but in the long term, we can make strategic decisions that the next time we're approached with short-term decisions, we can affect that outcome far in advance. So that's how this all sort of works out. Now, we make choices in the short term, and we make these choices with parts of our brain that react very quickly, but not necessarily logically. The logical centers of our brain rationalize the choices that we made later on. And the logical side of our brain is, you know, it's slower. And so when it comes to these life or death situations, like I need to jump because there's a snake in the way, you know, like in the orientation response, I need to be able to get out of the way of this venomous snake. We can't rationalize it's like, well, do I really need to jump? No, it just happens. You know, we respond to the environment. So some choices that we're making and some of the compounds that we're consuming are setting us up for failure later on. Or not necessarily failure, but they're influencing our future decision making later on. And so if we're conscious of what we're doing, how our reward system plays out in the future, we have more free will that we can exert on our future behavior. And if we manipulate our environment in other ways, we have less free will because we're just responding to some sort of system of addiction or chemical response. And so my goal is for this video is just to make people aware and conscious of their choices and how they're likely to play out in the future. You know, I also want to mention that these substances, you know, whether they're good or bad or whatever is sort of irrelevant. You know, like they're tools in a lot of cases, and they can have good uses, but we can also develop dependencies on them, and unfortunately, they can affect our behavior. So maybe you can come up with a strategy on how to use some of these chemicals effectively if you already use them, and how to make sure that they don't take control over your life or affect your behavior patterns in ways that you're not intending. So the first thing that I want to talk about is caffeine. Now, caffeine is a drug that's consumed by lots of people, and yes, it is a drug, and it does affect our behavior. You can become addicted to caffeine. You can become tolerant to caffeine. In fact, the research shows that within just a couple of months, you build up a pretty solid tolerance to caffeine. And unfortunately, with caffeine, let's say that you're consuming 200 milligrams of caffeine a day to get a certain effect. And what this compound does is it binds to the D1, and what this compound does is that it binds to the A1 receptors and also influences the A2A receptors that prevent the reuptake of adenosine, which is a neurotransmitter that makes you feel awake. Now, A1 and D1, which is the dopamine circuit, work in tandem. So if you're influencing one, you're also going to influence the other one. While it doesn't have a direct relationship with dopamine, it has a parallel relationship with dopamine, and that's important to understand too. But getting back to the scenario, you're taking 200 milligrams of dopamine, it's making you feel alert and awake, and then your tolerance level gradually builds up over the course of about 60 days. And all of a sudden that dose just doesn't have any influence on your body anymore, on your brain, on your nervous system. And during those 2 months, very valuable. There are studies that show sleep-deprived people in the gym, and some that have taken caffeine and some that haven't taken caffeine, and it turns out that the people taking caffeine perform much better. In fact, people who are not sleep-deprived end up performing much better on caffeine, and then over the course of 2 months, that sort of lessens over time. Unfortunately, if you up that dose from 200 milligrams to 300 milligrams after developing a tolerance, you don't see the same sort of performance gains. So increasing the dose doesn't seem to do anything differently to the people taking the compound to be higher performance. And that's going to go in all areas, not just in athletic performance, but cognitive performance too. So that cup of coffee that you've been having every morning to wake yourself up is going to become less and less effective over the time. And if you switch to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cups of coffee, it's really not going to make a difference for you. So that might influence your decision on how much caffeine you should be taking, because over a certain threshold, it's not going to do anything else except endanger you, basically, and overstimulate. The other thing that I want to point out is that when you abstain from caffeine, it sort of resets everything. You know, the receptor sites, through epigenetics, your body will make fewer A1 and A2A receptor sites, and so your body kind of resets over time. How long does this take? It's between 2 and 10 days. Okay, so when I did my dopamine protocol, I abstained for the full 10 days just to be safe, and I recommend that you consider abstaining from caffeine from 2 to 10 days every 2 months so that you can sort of reset your system. Otherwise, you develop sort of a dependence. Now, when I quit caffeine, I'm able to do so cold turkey without any problems. Not everybody's able to do that. Some people get headaches, some people get other withdrawal symptoms. So if that's the case with you, you might want to taper back. Maybe just add some hot water to your coffee or something, you know, to balance it out. Add some chicory root. Make a tea out of chicory root, or replace some of your coffee grounds with chicory root to give you that same coffee flavor without the caffeine, and eventually taper down to 0. Abstain for your window of time, 2 to 10 days, and then get off it for a little while. And then when you go back on, you're going to have more benefits, and you're going to have an increase in sensitivity to caffeine. All right, so the next compound I'm going to talk about is regularly used by lots of people, and again, it is a drug, and it has some positive effects and it has some negative effects on the body, and I'm talking about alcohol. And when I say alcohol, that's sort of a generic term for ethanol, which is sort of the recreational alcohol that we consume, and we get the sort of relaxing effects from the alcohol. Now, we seem to be able to have a beer and unwind, but that's not really what's happening, because alcohol, for a lot of people, is the most dopagenic compound you can take. And if your genetics are a certain way, there is nothing in the world that's going to stimulate those dopamine circuits more than alcohol. If you happen to fall into that category, your risk of becoming alcohol dependent or developing an unhealthy relationship with alcohol goes through the roof. The data also suggests that, through the University of McGill it was shown that men typically have 2 times higher chance of having those oversensitive dopamine circuits to alcohol. And over time, you start to build up that tolerance and even a dependency on alcohol as well. So does alcohol actually make you unwind? Well, how is it doing that if it's activating your dopamine circuits? So it's a depressant, but it's depressing certain parts of your neurological system, but with dopamine, it's really activating it, and so you're getting this dopamine blast, and this reward center in your brain is saying, I like this, keep doing this is great, and the calming effects are sort of artificial, because it's sort of like numbing the areas of your logical center of the brain down, but really overstimulating the amygdala, and sometimes even the limbic system. So these are, again, are the more primitive centers of the brain that have more to do with emotions, which is why you see people get too drunk. Sometimes their emotions get out of hand, or the fight or flight response kicks on, where sometimes, unfortunately, we see people who tend to be more violent with alcohol. And look, I'm not telling you anything you probably don't already know. That's just the risks that you take if you choose to engage in that sort of activity. So again, if you decide to drink, and you weigh the pros and the cons and say, okay, well, this, get in that socialization, go out with friends, having a beer, whatever. Just don't do it every day, obviously, because you'll build that tolerance, and definitely take breaks from it. Now, with alcohol, if you become so dependent on it, where it's like you've always got to have a drink, you've got to be drunk 24/7, you develop that kind of tolerance to it. Getting off alcohol is extremely difficult. It's one of those things that you get to the point where your doctor says, hey, if you don't stop drinking, you're going to die. But then there's the other component, which is if you stop drinking, you could also die, because it's replacing some of the compounds that your body normally makes, that your body stops making it. And so there's kind of a catch-22 there. Basically, you're taking a compound that's numbing down the logical centers of your brain, which is important for long-term strategy, and increasing your dependence upon the compound in the first place. And so when you try to rationalize consuming less alcohol or quitting drinking altogether, it can be a difficult choice because of the influence, of the unparalleled influence that it has there. And so a lot of people end up developing unhealthy relationship with alcohol as a result. So understand what's happening in your brain when you consume that compound, and definitely when they say, use this substance responsibly, it's especially the case with alcohol, because it can make you do things that you would never have done sober. For sure, don't let it get out of hand. It's easier to control and keep under control than it is to get out of a really bad situation. So prevent that from happening in the first place. And if you're in that scenario where the first thing you do when you wake up is, drink whiskey or something like that, get some help, go through rehab, give it your best shot, because it will kill you if you continue. All right, the next compound that I want to talk about is, again, not good or bad, it's just kind of a tool that this particular one deals with pain management. And I want to talk about a classification of drugs called opiates. Now, with opiates, there's no illusion that opiates are a drug. Everybody's aware of these. For the most part, you need a prescription to be able to get them, unless you're using street drug versions of them, or you're consuming compounds that mimic those effects, but I'll talk about that a little later. But with long-term pain treatment strategies, there's not a lot of good options, unfortunately. If you're taking non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, those are not great to take in the first place, and they're especially not great to take long-term, because your morbidity rate starts to go through the roof. It's really damaging to the gut, which is also damaging to your cardiovascular system. And the research for people that take something like ibuprofen every day does not look good. And so opiates actually tend to be the better long-term treatment option, even though they can be highly addictive and highly dopagenic. So again, like if someone's in pain, it's usually like not their fault. You know, they have an accident, they have an injury or something, and they're having to cope with this injury. And their doctors want to get them functional. So you can't really blame them too much for getting on this stuff in the first place, and they just become addicted. And it does have an impact on your behavioral system, on your, you know, your dopamine wiring, all this stuff. It plays a big role into the reward system. And again, it's one of those genetic things. Some people have a problem with it, some people don't. Some people can quit cold turkey. Some people have to really taper off, or else they start to get DTs. They'll shake, they'll sweat. You know, it's like that movie Trainspotting. You know, it can get really out of hand. And so, you know, it's just like, well, somebody has surgery or somebody has something like that, they need something to manage the pain, and then they stay on it long enough to where they get addicted, and getting off can be very challenging. The other thing I want to mention with opiates is that when you take opiates long term, and really any pain medication long term, there's this weird effect that can occur where you start to become more sensitive to pain because of the medication. And when you stop taking it, that pain goes away. And so that can have a weird effect on, do I need to keep taking this or not? And how much do I need to keep taking? It can make the dosage go up and up, where the solution should have been to just wean off, taper off in the first place, and then the pain just goes away. I hear a lot of stories of people who wean themselves off of opiates or other sorts of long-term pain medication, and all of a sudden the pain just goes away on its own. It not only affects the reward center of the brain, but it also affects your endorphins and, you know, how you feel and respond to pain. So it can be a tricky thing. After I'm done with this series, I'm going to release another video about cold laser therapy or low laser light therapy, and how to use that as a pain management tool, which for some people could be an alternative to drugs, which have a lot less side effects and actually make your body heal a little faster, reduce inflammation, increase mitochondrial output. And so I'm going to show you how to make your own device that's better than anything that you can find on the market, and using special equipment that for some reason the units that they're selling for thousands and thousands of dollars don't use, and to have a higher concentration and density and frequency of light and the way that light's diffused. And you can make these things for under $50. They're super easy to make. You don't have to be a genius when it comes to electronics to put it together. I'll show you a very simple way to do it and help you deal with pain and injuries. You know, if you have a shoulder thing or a knee thing or something like that, you know, I'll give you a protocol that you and your doctor can work with to really increase your recovery and deal with that pain that's at that site. Did you know that there are foods that mimic opiates and that bind to opioid receptors? Yeah, that's true. And a lot of these foods are dairy products, particularly cheese. When you consume cheese, there are compounds within the dairy that bind to your opiate receptors. So if you're eating a lot of cheese, it's kind of similar to being on opiates, and it can affect your reward center of the brain. It can affect the way your body feels pain, and it might be a good idea to abstain from cheese periodically as well, so that you're not playing around with those compounds that are basically mimicking the same pharmaceuticals that you would consume if you were injured. There are also other foods that can influence your dopamine structure in your brain. Basically anything that influences monoamines influences dopamine in one way or another. And so you have like cheese, you have certain types of seeds, particularly pumpkin seeds, and you also have soy products. And all of these contain compounds that have an influence on your monoamine structure, which dopamine is, by the way. So be conscious of this and maybe take breaks from those things as well. Some people got this confused because they think it's the tyrosine in proteins that are affecting dopamine, and that's not really true. Now, if you take straight tyrosine, straight L-tyrosine in a powdered form or in a capsule, probably in a capsule because it tastes terrible, that does convert into dopamine directly. If you're taking on an empty stomach, it definitely has that component to it where, you know, it has like a nootropic effect, and a lot of nootropic stacks will have some L-tyrosine in it. But essentially, if you're getting a whole protein chain, you don't really need to worry about it because the body doesn't treat it the same way. There are other compounds within these foods that play a much bigger role in the dopamine circuits, and it might be good to take breaks from them periodically. So I talked about monoamines and how dopamine is a monoamine, but there are an entire class of drugs called MAOI inhibitors, and MA of course stands for monoamine. I'm not saying if you're on an MAOI inhibitor that you should quit cold turkey or say, oh, well, I need to take breaks from this. That might not be the best thing to do. MAOIs are tricky, and not everybody does well on them, and they're prescribed to just about everyone without the doctor really digging into the genetics of the individual and figuring out, well, is this a good idea or not? There's a particular genetic cascade called MTHFR, which deals with methylation. And if you're an undermethylator, and that's a little bit broad, if you have certain polymorphisms or genetic variances of MTHFR, you can have some pretty detrimental reactions to MAOI inhibitors. Case in point, and without going into too much detail here and getting our channel demonetized, there have been just catastrophic events in the United States committed by individuals who were all on MAOI inhibitors, and it turns out they all had these genetic variations in combination. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that the two of those things combined, and research is starting to come out showing that if you have these genetic variants, you should not be on an MAOI inhibitor. You should look for a different treatment plan. But if you're good, you don't have those genetic variations, and you're taking an MAOI inhibitor, and it's working for you, you probably don't want to cycle off. But I also want to talk about certain compounds that, again, they're basically select MAOI inhibitors, particularly MAOI-B, that have an influence on dopamine. You might be taking these and not actually understanding what they do. And so I want to create that awareness as well. And so the compounds that I'm talking about are licorice, passion flower, black pepper, green tea, and unfortunately even turmeric. So again, these are all kind of tools that you can use, and there's some health benefits, especially to black pepper. You know, it's a great antimicrobial. The green tea, you know, a lot of people take it for longevity, and the L-theanine that's used in combination with a little bit of caffeine you get. Passion flower, you know, kind of helps people relax a little bit. Turmeric, great anti-inflammatory. A lot of people cook with that. But unfortunately, they all have an effect on dopamine, and it might be a good idea to have some kind of awareness of it and see if it's having an effect on you. Get your DNA sequenced and see how sensitive you are to these compounds, and maybe cycle off of them every once in a while so that you can kind of reset your tolerance to these compounds, so that you don't have to keep taking them, you know, all the time and to get the same effect. You know, sort of along the same vein, I would just like to mention benzodiazepines, which are also very dopogenic, and you know, some people take them for anxiety. And some people take variations of these too that occur in nature, like phenibut, which is kind of like a gray market supplement. Not quite illegal, but still kind of sketchy. And then kava. Some people drink kava tea to kind of relax, and it's not that far off from taking something like Valium or Xanax. So be careful with those natural supplements, because pharmacokinetically you can't really tell much of a difference between that and a prescription drug, and it can definitely mess up with your rewards system. You can definitely build up a tolerance to it, become addicted, and if you stop, develop withdrawal symptoms. So be careful. The next thing I want to talk about is adaptogenic herbs. And a lot of people take adaptogens to either manage their stress. When they're overly stressed, they need something to kind of help them. And some of them mimic cortisol and epinephrine and all these things, which are linked to dopamine and D1. And some people take things that are sort of do the opposite thing, which sort of downregulate those centers, and that also has an effect on dopamine. It also increases dopamine. Weird, right? And I'm talking about herbs like rhodiola and ashwagandha. A lot of people take the rhodiola to kind of speed themselves up and be able to manage stress, and a lot of people take ashwagandha to kind of relax and calm down. They do have a pretty powerful pharmacokinetic effect, so just be aware of it and maybe consider cycling that, not taking it every day. I mean, do you have 7 days a week where you just gotta have rhodiola and you've gotta be on, and deal with that stress? Or, can you take a day off every once in a while, or maybe even a week off? Same thing with ashwagandha. Do you need that level of relaxation every day, or can you do something else to relax, maybe like meditate or do some breathing exercises, something to that effect, where you don't need drugs to do that, and you don't have to do that part of the dopamine reset. All right, the next thing that I want to talk about are nootropic drugs. These are drugs that people use to perform at a higher cognitive state. A lot of business people, CEOs, people that really need to use their brain effectively, take these compounds to get an added benefit, an added boost. They work, a lot of them work, but they also have an effect on the dopamine circuits in the brain, so use great caution with them. So when it comes to things like modafinil or the derivatives of that some people take to get a performance boost, again, be careful. Don't take it every single day, and there are some pretty substantial side effects. I used to do technical support for a company that recommended this as a supplement and claimed that it was safer than Tylenol, and I would get people that would have like Steven Johnson syndrome, where their skin would be peeling off as a result. So for some people, just don't manage them very well. I think they're a lot riskier than some of the interwebs and personalities would claim them to be. But your racetams, your cholines, your huperzine A's, all of these compounds that increase memory, increase cognitive processing speed, increase your ability to layer and multitask. They work really well, but there's no free rides. And so it's good to take breaks from these things and think really, like, do you have to be that high performance every day, and what is it worth to you? Because eventually they'll become habitual and you won't get the same effect from them. So be cautious, be aware, and don't let them take over your life. Because in the short term, you might not see this happening, but in the long-term picture, it will influence your behavior patterns. I'm going to go ahead and throw nicotine into the nootropics category, because essentially I think that's kind of what it's used for, either recreationally or whether you're conscious of it or not. I think that's kind of what people use it for, is just to get a little kick, a little boost. And of course, everybody knows that nicotine is addictive. But how addictive is nicotine? Not as addictive as you might think. The reason why people have trouble kicking that habit is because of the dopamine pathways that are built and those behavioral patterns that develop. But actually, nicotine leaves the body so quickly that you don't really even get withdrawal symptoms from them. So you don't really need to go on a nicotine patch or gum or anything like that. You can cold turkey nicotine and you're not going to have an issue with it. And the cravings you're having are just because of those patterns that you've developed over the course of the usage of nicotine. And just my advice would be to develop new patterns, okay? Or not get into those situations in the first place when you're developing those patterns, because it's easier to not develop them in the first place than sort of break those habits. And that's true of everything that I've just listed. And again, everything that I've listed has a purpose, okay? And it can be effective for certain things. Like I think Emerson probably wrote some great literature drunk, but with the whole philosophy of write drunk, edit sober. But is it worth it in the long run? And could Emerson have written that stuff sober and not had to deal with the hangovers and the liver problems and all this other kind of stuff? So I just hope that you can go through this list, and of course there's other compounds that I didn't mention, but these are the most common ones I think that people maybe not are 100% aware of how much impact they're having on your life, and maybe consider cycling off or abstaining from them altogether if you're not willing to make those trade-offs, because all of these things come with a trade-off. You get some positive benefits, and there's also things that you need to be conscious of. And if you're smart, you can get the benefits without getting so many side effects and so many long-term behavioral problems if you take breaks and you don't use them any more often than you really need to. And it's always good to work with somebody that's watching you and that knows you, your doctor, your therapist, your performance coach, whoever you're working with, so that they can kind of monitor your behavior and say, oh, that's why this is happening. It's because your dopamine circuits are out of control. You need to reset. Okay, so just take this all in stride. Don't obsess or over worry about any of it, but do be aware of how these compounds are functioning and how they affect your brain and your behaviors, because the more you use them, the less free will that you're going to have. The more biological determinism kicks in. Again, nature versus nurture. That environmental change that you're causing. These compounds are very powerful, and they really affect the brain. And you may not be aware of it because you rationalize your choices. Okay. In the short term, you're using different parts of your brain that are not logical. So set up good paths, set up good behavior patterns, set yourself up for success, and don't become dependent on any of these compounds. Again, for more information, go to FixYourGut.com. Like and subscribe. I sort of did a different format this time. Instead of with the whiteboard, try to do things digitally. If you like that, hit like. If you don't, well, you know what to do. And if you've got any questions or anything, leave it in the comments. I try to engage with the community as much as possible. And check out our members section if you want to get hardcore with this stuff and go into more detail. There's some interviews and debates that I have with John. We have a good time on the members section, so it's reasonably priced, and it's a fun community that we have. So consider joining. All right. We'll see you next time with part 3, which is going to be behavioral and lifestyle choices that affect the wiring of your brain. All right, take it easy.